A very big Supreme Court decision came through today on the issue of sex and gender, and I want to talk a little bit about what it means and what it doesn't mean. So, this ruling goes to the very heart of the Equality Act, which, if you watch any of my videos, you know is one of the key pieces of legislation that protects all workers in the UK. You might think that discrimination might not apply to you, but everyone has a gender, everyone has an age. Lots of people can become disabled as they move through life. So the Equality Act is such an important piece of legislation, and it's a big deal when it gets interpreted or when anything comes out new about its interpretation. And when it comes to this case, which comes down to gender, sex, and trans rights, I think it's really important to understand exactly what the Supreme Court ruling was about and what the actual Equality Act interpretation means. Because this is not some kind of Supreme Court ruling that says, for example, that trans people do not exist, or even that trans people do not have rights. However, the way that they have interpreted the Equality Act as written has eroded some trans rights. So let's look at the specifics. This was not a Supreme Court case. It's easy to politicize these things or sensationalize them. This wasn't, trans rights up on the kind of judicial docket. This was a very specific case asking a very specific question. And that question was, when it comes to gender equality reporting, should a trans person count for their sex assigned at birth or for the gender that they have, assuming that they have a gender recognition certificate? Really, this is an even more nuanced legal question, not a sensationalized headline, because it's really asking, the Supreme Court has been asked to interpret, how does the Equality Act and the Gender Rights Act interact with each other? So if someone has been given a gender recognition certificate for female, does that mean that they count when it comes to the Equality Act as a woman? Or does it not? What does the Equality Act interpret that as? So again, this is not about whether or not trans people have the right to live, to work without discrimination. The Supreme Court makes it super clear right from the very beginning that trans people's rights are in the Equality Act, intact, have not been changed. However, this is the very narrow scope that they are looking at. So let's look at what they actually said about that. So the Supreme Court said basically that their interpretation is that the Equality Act, when it means sex assigned at birth. Now, I've seen headlines say Supreme Court rules that legal definition of women does not include trans women, for example. I don't agree with that. I think the Supreme Court ruling says that the Equality Act, one piece of legislation, has defined sex in this particular way as written. And they give their reasons for this interpretation. One of the big ones is that if you look at a lot of the sex protections in the Equality Act, they're linked to pregnancy and maternity. So they interpreted that to mean that it intended to be sex as defined at birth rather than via gender recognition certificate. And they also pointed out that sex as defined at birth and sex as, for example, written on a gender recognition certificate would mean two different definitions of the word within the Equality Act, and it wouldn't be clear as to which one it might be referring to. So whether or not you agree with that, it's clear that this isn't about whether or not these people have rights, but interpretation of the language as written and its impact. Now, this doesn't mean that it doesn't degrade trans people's rights. It absolutely does. So let's talk about what rights trans people have and what rights this has degraded. Now, the super key thing to understand is that sex is one of the 9 protected characteristics in the Equality Act. And there is another protected characteristic specifically for trans people called the gender reassignment protected characteristic. That one was written specifically for trans people and over time has expanded to support non-binary people in some situations as well. That right absolutely has not changed with the Supreme Court ruling, and they say that very early on in the ruling, that this right is completely intact, they have no interest in changing it, and they wanted to really emphasize that this isn't about taking away rights from trans people, this is about interpreting the law that they have been asked to interpret. To be clear, Employers, anybody else, cannot discriminate against someone because they are trans. That's absolutely against the law as stipulated in the Equality Act 2010. That has not changed. What has changed is that trans people who are, say, for example, female, can no longer rely, even if they have a gender recognition certificate, on the ability to access female-only spaces and have the right to do that. Because this ruling says that any protection that you have, which is sex-based, is limited to the sex actually assigned at birth. And this will have an effect on trans people. So let's say, for example, a trans woman is seeking support in a domestic violence situation, and she is looking to gain access to a women's only shelter. In the past, she would have had two protections there. Let's say she had a gender recognition certificate. She could say, I have access to this because I am a woman, and you are not able to deny me that. And also, you cannot deny me access just because I am trans. What this ruling is saying is that first pillar of that support no longer works because the gender recognition certificate definition of sex does not override the intention of the Equality Act when it talked about sex. It also creates some bizarre situations, like, for example, equality reporting, let's say for salaries. This ruling now means that someone who is assigned male at birth but is a woman, a trans woman, their salary would count towards the male column rather than the female column, and vice versa. So this definitely does have an impact on trans people. However, it is not what the headlines are making it out to be as well, which is some kind of blanket definition of what a gender is and any kind of carte blanche to treat trans people in any kind of a discriminatory way. I want to be super clear here again. It is absolutely illegal to discriminate against someone in work or elsewhere because they are trans. That was true yesterday, it's true today, and it will be true tomorrow. And as I said at the beginning, this is not a topic that just applies to one group of people. The Equality Act is integral for all of our rights, and so it is worth paying attention when it's interpreted and when things change about it, because we will all fall under one of those protected characteristics at some point in our lives, and it's very important to stay aware to what's going on with its interpretation and any changes in everyone's rights.